Camera tracking really opens up a ton of possibilities when it comes to visual effects, and while the 3D camera tracker in After Effects is really useful, it tends to fail a lot more than it succeeds. Now, Blender is not a tracking program, it's mainly used for 3D modeling and animating and stuff like that, but it's got a lot of other useful tools up its sleeve, motion tracking being one of them. And the best part is that it's open source and free. So that's why instead of whipping out one of those other dedicated programs, I'll be showing you how to motion track in Blender and then bringing that camera data back over to After Effects to make my monitor look a lot cooler. Of course, if you're only interested in replacing what's on your screen, you can easily just use the built-in Mocha planar tracker that comes with After Effects. But even a simple screen replacement can be improved if you get the 3D camera data too. For example, with that data, if you toss a light in the scene, you can introduce some fake glare to your screen and make it blend with your footage a lot better. In terms of what you're shooting, it's really helpful to have things in frame that clearly show perspective. So things that have 4 defined sides with decent contrast, like these squares on my screen, are a perfect example. But other options could be things like business cards or credit cards or Yu-Gi-Oh cards, any card really. A phone on your desk would probably work, a tablet if it wasn't placed so terribly. You get the point. Having something where all 4 corners are visible help with perspective tracking a ton. Another tip that's actually really important is having points to track at different distances from the camera. If all of my tracking points were on the monitor itself, the track would be pretty rough. But by seeing how points at different distances move in relation to each other, the camera itself can build a more accurate picture of the scene. Not gonna lie, I sort of forgot about that for this example. But instead of reshooting it to include some more trackable features, I thought I'd just try to make it work as is, because not every piece of footage you track is gonna be perfect, so why would I try to teach you how to track with perfect footage? Also, I didn't want to clean my desk again. So now let's actually get to it. Go ahead and throw your footage into a new comp in After Effects because we need to convert it to an image sequence. So head to Composition, Add to Render Queue, and then set the format to a JPEG sequence and render it out. Next, we'll open up Blender and choose the VFX template file, so the motion tracking panel is already there for us. You can go ahead and get rid of the top 2 windows by moving your mouse to the top corner of a panel, and when it turns into a cross like this, just click and drag over to the panel next to it. Then just do the same thing by making the tracking panel take over the top one, and we're good. Now we can hit open, choose one of the files in our image sequence, and load it up. Next, over here on the right, you can see how many frames your footage is, so go down here and adjust the end frame of the timeline. Then with your mouse over the graph timeline, hit the home key on your keyboard to adjust the view so that our full frame range is visible. Awesome, now we can actually start tracking our footage. You can navigate the window by dragging these icons around or by using the scroll wheel. Scrolling in and out will zoom, clicking in on the scroll wheel and moving around will pan. To place down a tracking marker, just hold Control, or I'm guessing Command on a Mac, and click wherever you want to place it. Just like in After Effects, the tracking points in Blender have 2 boxes. The pattern box is what you're telling it to look for from frame to frame, and the search box, which can be made visible from up here, is the area you're letting it search in when trying to find the next frame's pattern box. So if you already know about how After Effects trackers work, they're pretty similar to the search region and feature region that they have. On the left here, we can change the default settings for new tracking points that we make, but to actually change the settings for the current tracking point selected, you have to do it on the right side under the Track tab. So for tracking a 3D scene where the camera is moving around and changing perspective, we'll want to get some good perspective tracking data first, so I'll choose the perspective tracking type. I'll also enable normalization, which basically just tries to ignore lighting changes in case your tracker goes into shadow or is flickering, and I'll raise the correlation to 0.9. Essentially what that means is when I tell it to track forwards, I want the tracker to be at least 90% sure it's right before moving to the next frame. With those settings taken care of, I'll make a new tracking point by control clicking again. If you want to move the point, all you have to do is have it selected and hit G, which is Blender's position shortcut. Then you can just move it by moving your mouse around and left clicking to place it. You can also cancel a move by right clicking and it'll go back to the position it had before you tried to change it. The same stuff goes for scale and rotation, which is the S key and the R key. If you're new to Blender and don't want to mess around with shortcuts, you can also manipulate the marker from the Track tab's marker settings. Now moving the point over, I'm going to grab the corners of the pattern box and align them with my little square, which is going to give me a really good perspective track because it's got 4 clear edges with high contrast between it and its background. Once I've got it lined up, I can start tracking forward with this button over here or by pressing Ctrl T. I should also mention that just like After Effects, the larger the search area is, the longer it takes to track, so if you know your point's not going to move a lot from frame to frame, you can make your search area smaller to speed things up. One thing that's really helpful is to lock your view to the tracking marker you have selected, which kind of keeps it centered at all times. To do that, you can hit L on your keyboard and you should see it say locked in the top left. Now I'll just go ahead and track the rest of these points on my screen so that I can show you some examples of less ideal tracking points. By the way, sometimes it's helpful to add a bunch of points and set them up, and then select them all and track them all forward at the same time. Okay, so after tracking all of those really good tracking points, you might think that I have a golden camera solve now. But that's not the case. The reason it's so bad is because, as I mentioned before, to get a good track of your scene, you need points at different distances so that the information between how points move in relation to each other, or the parallax, can help the program figure out the camera move. One option I have with this footage is to track the lights on my router back here. Instead of trying to track the perspective on these lights and getting an alright at best track on them, we're actually going to benefit a lot more by just getting a really good location and scale data track. Out of the three, the light that's furthest on the right will definitely give us the best track because you can see it all the way through. But first I'll just track the second point to show you what to do when something gets blocked. So I'll make sure I'm at the beginning of the timeline, control click to add another marker, and start the track forward. After it realizes it doesn't have a good track anymore, it'll stop and disable the marker from that point onwards. Now I'll just backtrack a little bit because it gets a little weird towards the end there, and then clear all the tracking data to the right of this point. Then I'll move forward in the timeline until I think the point's trackable again, hit G to adjust the position, and track it the rest of the way forward. While it's disabled in the middle here, it won't affect the camera solve, so you don't have to worry about it messing anything up. Alright, now that I've got some points tracked that are further from the camera than the screen markers, you can see that the camera solve is definitely coming along and getting more stable. But it's still pretty jittery, so I'll continue adding points, this time shooting for one or two that's closer to the camera. This part of the spacebar on my keyboard is less than ideal, but it should get the job done. I'll set the tracking type to affine, which is basically position, scale, rotation, and skew, and then just track it forward, which gives us this. So now that we've got at least one point on either side of the monitor, the track is looking a lot more stable. Paying attention to the grid lines, I think the track would honestly be good enough for the screen replacement that we're going for. Although, if we wanted to do some more advanced 3D stuff, we'd really need a more stable track, because in the distance you could tell it's not super accurate, and as you get further from the monitor, it gets more and more jittery. Through some trial and error, I got a decent affine track on some other keys on my keyboard. I grabbed a location scale track of the mouse pointer on my second screen, and on that same monitor, we can even do a pretty decent perspective track on the dock. When trying to figure out what would give a good perspective track, you just need to think of how the tracker could get it wrong. Looking at the preview up here, these icons give the tracker enough information to align itself correctly, so it's not super likely it's going to slip off target too much. Typically, you'll want the trackable features to go right up to the edges of the pattern area, just so it can align itself as accurately as possible. Alright, so now that I've got a decent amount of points, I'll show you how to solve the camera. The first thing you can do to improve the solve results right off the bat are to go to the camera settings over here and enter in your camera sensor width. There's a bunch of presets you can choose from right here, including some phones, but if what you're looking for isn't here, it's just one Google search away. For those of you who might feel a bit overwhelmed, just Google the sensor size of whatever you recorded with and you'll get something like this. Then just take the width and chuck that in Blender. So over here on the left, we'll just go to the Solve menu and check the keyframe box. This lets Blender choose the A and B keyframes automatically. My understanding of what the A and B keyframes are is a range of keyframes from A to B that has stable tracking data and shows good parallax. You'll be able to set this manually later if you want to try and get a better track result, but next we'll head over to the Refine dropdown and choose Focal Length, K1, and K2. This lets Blender try to figure out the focal length and lens distortion of our footage. Next we'll just go ahead and click Solve Camera Motion. And after a little while, it'll spit out a solve error for us. This is essentially how bad it thinks it solved the camera. 0 would be a perfect solve, which I don't think is possible. Between 0 and 0.3 I'd say is a pretty solid track. Between 0.3 and 0.6 is a decent track, and then upwards from there is a little rough, so I'd make some tweaks and try to get it as low as possible. If your solve error is 100 or higher, which sometimes happens, something probably went wrong. The first thing I would try to do is uncheck the keyframe option and manually try to set the A and B keyframes. Then hit solve again and keep messing with your A and B keyframes until you get the solve error as low as possible. Hopefully after that you should be in the clear. To refine our track, once it's not terrible, we can toggle on the marker info up here. This shows us the average error of each tracking point. So if you put your mouse over the footage and hit A, you'll select all the markers and you'll be able to see all of their average scores. If you have a point or two that has an unusually large error compared to the rest of them, go ahead and select it, hit X, and then click to delete it. Then just solve again. Try not to delete too many points in one go like I just did, but instead delete the one with the highest solve error, and then resolve your camera, and then keep repeating that process. I already knew which ones to delete in my footage because I put them there to delete them. If after getting rid of all of the unusually bad points you still don't have a decent track below 0.6, then you might need to add more points and play with your A and B keyframes. Once you do have a good track, hit solve one more time and then choose a point to act as the origin. For me in this example, I'll choose the center of the monitor. After that, select a point to the left or right of it that's roughly on the same plane and set it as the x-axis. Then go ahead and choose Setup Tracking Scene. Now to actually see the solved camera and scene, go ahead and hit the plus up top and then go to General and then choose Layout. I'll just select the cube and then holding Control select the ground as well, hit X and delete them. By the way, if you're hitting X and you're not seeing the option to delete them, it's probably because your mouse isn't over top of the 3D view window. A lot of the keyboard shortcuts in Blender are dependent on where your mouse is, so you just have to be aware of where you have your mouse when you're pressing these shortcuts. Alright, so now let's head up here and enable our motion tracking points. And again, if you're new to Blender and you don't quite know how to navigate, you can always use these icons up here to move around. It's pretty self-explanatory, but clicking and dragging on this axis thing will rotate you around, magnifying glass will zoom you in and out, and the hand will let you pan around. The shortcuts for these, by the way, are clicking in the scroll wheel will let you rotate around, scrolling in and out will zoom you in and out, obviously, and holding shift while you click in the scroll wheel will let you pan around. So to get a better understanding of what tracking points are what, we can click 0 on our number pad or click this camera icon to look through the camera and see our footage overlaid on the scene. And now you can clearly see which tracking markers are what if you didn't see it before. Now for this footage, since I didn't have a lot or any really tracking points on my table, I set my origin to the tracking point in the center of the screen, which is why it's sitting at the origin of the whole scene. And I also chose the marker on the left of it and set that as the x-axis. If we head up here to the little axis orb and we click on the X, we'll snap our view perfectly to the X-axis. And now we can see that ignoring the rotation of the markers because they're facing the camera, if you just look at the center of them, all of the markers that are on my main monitor are perfectly aligned to the X-axis. And they're also all vertically aligned on the Z-axis as well, which is great. If you ever need to fix or reorient where the markers are, which we actually do need to do, they're all actually children of the camera object. So if we select the camera and then head over to this transform icon, we get to see all of the transform options right on the camera. And so by doing anything to the camera, the markers are also going to move and rotate with it. Now everything's aligned pretty much perfectly except for the fact that the floor is set to the center of my monitor. We can fix this pretty easily just by eyeballing it because we can see the markers that are attached to my keyboard. And again, if you're ever not sure what a marker is, you can just hit 0 or click the camera icon and switch to the camera view, select the marker from there and then switch back out. So just grabbing the camera, I'm going to raise it up so that the floor is roughly where I think my table would be. Then I'll just switch back to camera view and scrub back and forth and just look at the grid and see if it tracks well with the table. Anyways, to export this camera data to After Effects, you have to make sure you have the add-on first. To do that, go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then search for After Effects' Import Export add-on. Once you've got it, just toggle it on. Then with the camera selected, you can go to File, Export, Adobe After Effects. Find a place to save the file and make sure you have all the boxes ticked on the right. Then we can close down Blender and finally go back to our After Effects project. In After Effects, go to File, Scripts, Run Script File, and choose the file we just exported. It'll ask us to name the composition it's going to make and then just hit OK. After you open it, we'll see a camera and a bunch of nulls that are just each of our tracking points. Select one of the nulls from our monitor as well as the camera and then just copy them and paste into our footage comp. And that's it. The 3D camera data is imported into After Effects for us to use however we want. To show you a little demo, I'll just create a new solid, make sure it's a 3D layer, and then holding shift, I'll pick whip it to our null so that it's placed correctly for our screen in 3D space. Then I'll just scale it down a bit, take the pen tool, and create a mask covering the screen. Next, I'll add a small feather to the mask by like 1 pixel and expand it back out, also by like a pixel. Then I'll duplicate the camera, null, and solid and pre-compose them, moving all attributes and calling it screen matte. Then I'll select the masked solid we duplicated and rename it to ring 1. And with it selected, I'll go to Layer, Solid Settings, and change it to white. Next, I'll hit M to open up its masks, and with it selected, I'll duplicate it with Control or Command D. Setting the second mask to subtract, I'll lower its expansion so that the first mask adds a rectangle, while the second smaller mask subtracts one, leaving us with just a border. Then I'll hit P to expand the position and increase the Z position by like 20, which just moves it backwards away from the camera. If we play that back, we can start to feel some depth in our monitor. To build off that, we'll just duplicate the ring, and each time we'll send it another 20 pixels back in Z space and create a sort of tunnel. One problem that we're going to run into though is that we can see the tunnel outside of our screen. To fix that, we'll just duplicate the camera and select it along with all of the rings we created and pre-compose them. We can name it something like Inside Screen. Next, search for and apply the Set Matte effect to our inside screen layer and set the matte to our screen matte layer. But wait, there's more. Why not take it just a little bit further? Let's head into our inside screen comp and add a few more rings. Then to create a bigger sense of depth and fall off, we can lower the opacity by 10 as the rings get further away, which gives us this cool look. Also, at the beginning of the video I mentioned that with the 3D camera data we can fake some screen glare too, so let's chuck that in as well. Let's head on back to our main comp and lock its composition panel. Then double click the screen matte comp to open another composition panel, and we'll drag that one to the side so we can see both at the same time. Inside the screen matte comp, create a new point light, then holding shift, pick whip it to our null so that we don't have to go looking for the light. Hit P to bring up its position and lower its Z value to bring it closer to the camera and away from the screen. Then we can just use the X and Y arrows to reposition it further. Next, expand the solid and expand its material options as well. Here we can tweak how it's affected by the After Effects lights. I'll just raise the specular intensity and shininess both to 100, lower the metal to around 70, and raise the diffuse to 100. Then I'll just reposition the light somewhere to the left to match the direction of my window from the footage. Scrubbing forward, you can see what the glare will look like and adjust the light's position until you're happy with it. And once you like it, just close the screen matte composition panel and we've got glare. Now to blend our screen in with the footage a bit more, I'll select both the screen matte and inside screen compositions and pre-compose them one more time and call it screen elements. Now I can toss levels on it and eyeball it until I think the contrast matches. One more thing I'd probably throw on is a faint glow. I'd push it above the levels so that the levels applies to the glow as well, raise the glow radius a bunch as well as the threshold, and then lower the intensity so that it's not too powerful. And that's it. That's how you track your camera in Blender and import that data back to After Effects. Once you do that, you can really go wild and do whatever you want. Replace the screen, make the screen a weird portal, or just throw the Blender camera into a different Blender scene, render that out, and then composite it in After Effects. The world is your oyster, and you are someone who really likes oysters in this hypothetical analogy. Is it an analogy? Metaphor? I don't know the difference. It's kind of embarrassing. I mean, I'm sitting in front of my computer. I could just look it up. It's not that hard to do. You know, like why am I even including all this in the video? I could just not be saying this and not look like an idiot, but why are you still here, by the way? The video ended a little bit ago. You're still here.